It was supposed to be just another sleepover at our friend Liam's house. We were around 13 at the time and really into video games. Liam was the only one who had a PlayStation among our group, so we would often go to his house. This one day, though, his parents were away for a wedding and were going to return quite late into the night, and that for us was the perfect moment to try the Doritos horror game. So this new online horror game by the brand Doritos was launched in the late 2000s as a marketing ploy to promote their old flavors, which they were bringing back. It was barely there for a few months before being pulled off. A few kids in our school have tried the game and suddenly it became a buzz because it was genuinely scary. Well, as scary as it could be for a bunch of 13-year-olds. I remember the excitement that buzzed through us as we gathered in Liam's dimly lit living room, eager to dive into the Doritos horror game. There were 7 of us, sprawled across couches and pillows, the glow of the PC casting eerie shadows on the walls. Liam had always been a bit intense, but that night he seemed even more on edge, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap from the corners. As the game loaded, I caught Liam whispering to himself, a habit he'd had since he was young, but this time it sent a chill down my spine. "It's just a game," he muttered, more to himself than to any of us. We shrugged it off, diving into the digital horror unfolding before us. The game was terrifying, more than any of us had anticipated. It played tricks on the mind, blurring the lines between the game's world and our reality. There was a level which featured a wailing ghost of a lady, which I believe was the final trigger. Liam suddenly paused the game, his hands trembling. "Did you guys see that? The shadows, they're watching us," he whispered, his voice hoarse. We laughed it off, assuming it was just Liam being weird. We didn't know then that he had a condition. As the game progressed and we got genuinely scared, Liam's behavior grew more erratic. He started flinching at every sound, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the screen. "They're here," he hissed suddenly, making us all jump. "They're here for us." "Chill out, Liam, it's just a game." I tried to calm him, but my own voice faltered, infected by the tension gripping the room. "No, Adrian, you don't understand!" Liam's voice broke into a scream. "They're not just in the game, they're in this room. They want to drag us into their world." We tried to laugh it off, but the laughter died in our throats as Liam scrambled to his feet, his movement jerky and uncoordinated. He dashed to the kitchen, and we heard drawers fly open, objects clattering to the floor.
"What's he doing?"
whispered Rachel, her face pale in the flickering light of the TV. "Probably just trying to scare us," Mark replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The seconds stretched into eternity before Liam reappeared at the doorway, a kitchen knife clutched in each hand. His eyes were wild, red, unrecognizable. He pointed a knife at us, his hand shaking violently. "They told me what I have to do," he rasped. "I have to kill you all to save myself." Panic erupted. Chairs overturned. Someone screamed, a high keening sound that was abruptly cut off as Liam lunged. The game, forgotten, continued to flicker on the screen, its eerie soundtrack playing to an empty room as we scattered, trying desperately to escape our friend who had turned into a stranger. Chaos reigned as we all scrambled for safety. Liam wasn't mentally there. He no longer recognized any of us, his friends, as anything more than threats. His screams filled the house, a mix of rage and terror, as he chased after us with knives gleaming in the dim light. Only when he got to Mark did we realize this was too real. Mark brought his left hand up to defend himself, but Liam sliced at it like cutting through butter. Mark's thick blood sprayed on the floor as everyone started screaming. I hid behind the sofa, my heart pounding so badly I was sure it would give me away. Through the small gap between the couch and the floor, I watched Liam's feet move frantically around the room. His voice was relentless. "You can't hide! I have to do this! It's the only way to end the game! Kill them all! Kill them all! Kill them!" His words were punctuated by the sounds of objects being thrown and furniture being overturned. Rachel, braver than the rest, tried to reason with him.
Liam, please, man, put the knives down. We're your friends.
But his plea fell on deaf ears. Liam rounded on her, slashing wildly. A scream escaped her lips as he fell backward, clutching her face. I looked up in horror to see a clean cut running down from her left eye all the way till her neck. The situation was spiraling out of control. Every shout and cry felt like it was from a horror movie, not a reality. I knew I had to do something. Mustering all my courage, I crept from my hiding spot and made a dash for the kitchen. My plan was to find something to defend myself with, or better yet, something to subdue Liam. In the kitchen, I grabbed a frying pan, my hands slick with sweat. I turned just in time to see Liam enter, his eyes scanning wildly.
Adrian!
His voice cracked, a mixture of fury and confusion.
Why are you doing this? Why are you all turning against me? You were always in the Devil's team, weren't you?
It's not us, Liam. It's the game. It's messing with your head, I shouted, hoping to break through his delusion. He paused, confusion crossing his features for a split second before it was replaced with renewed conviction. He lunged at me, knives slashing. I swung the frying pan with all my might, hitting him on the side of the head. Liam staggered back, stunned. I grabbed whatever my hands could get and threw at him. Bananas, milk cartons, glass bowls. He just kept swinging the knife. That's when a milk carton got punctured and his knife got stuck. As the milk dripped, I ran out to save my life. Liam tried to give a chase but slipped on the milk and hit his head against the kitchen counter. Breathing heavily, I dropped the pan, which was still in my hand, my entire body shaking. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police. My friends had opened the door and ran out to the neighbors. Police barged in just in time as Liam came out again and 2 officers pinned him down. When Liam's parents arrived, the scene they encountered was one of horror. Furniture overturned, bloodstains on the carpet and walls, and their son, now handcuffed and being led away by the police. Recovery was slow. Physically, the wounds healed, but the psychological scars remained. We visited Liam in the hospital where he was under psychiatric care. He didn't remember that night. The look of horror and disbelief on his face when we told him what happened was heartbreaking. We lost a part of our friend that day. I remember it vividly. That night, Abdul and I decided to play the Doritos horror game back in 2010. We were just 2 curious 13-year-olds looking for a thrill on a Friday night while my parents were away for a night. Little did we know, that night would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. As we fired up the game on my old PC, the atmosphere in my room shifted immediately. The air seemed heavier, and an eerie feeling settled over us. Abdul laughed nervously, brushing off the strange sensation.
Come on, Brian, it's just a game,
he said, trying to reassure me. So, Doritos launched this online game in the late 2000s, which used the devices and user data to create spooky, original, out-of-the-world horror experiences. It became a hit, but was soon shut down. No one knows the exact reason why such a popular cult game was suddenly pulled off. What happened that night back in 2010, I don't think it was just the game. We had recently shifted to this new house since my dad had suffered a loss in his business, and he decided to sell our own house and rent a new one for the time. It was big, but really cheap. The reason being is that it sat next to a graveyard. Now, our house wasn't much religious, and since my parents were themselves Dutch immigrants, we didn't mind the macabre scenery out of the windows. But I'd heard things in the night sometimes, sounds that shouldn't be heard. And what happened that night, I'd put the finger on the graveyard next to the house rather than the horror game we were eager to explore. My parents didn't allow me to use the computer past 9, But since they were staying overnight in a different city where Dad had gone for a meeting, I invited my school friend Abdul for a sleepover. The game started innocuously enough. We navigated through the virtual hotel's dimly lit corridors, our tasks illuminated only by the flickering light of the game. But as the clock struck midnight, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the eerie sounds from the game or the ghostly light casting long shadows across the room. It was something else, an unsettling feeling that we were not alone. A sudden sharp knock on the window snapped us out of our focus. We paused the game and glanced at each other, hearts racing. "Probably just a branch," I muttered, though the nearest tree was too far to touch the glass. Cautiously, we peered outside, but the darkness hid whatever had made the noise. We could only spot the misty graveyard in the distance. Shaken, we returned to our game, trying to laugh it off. Moments later, the game took a terrifying turn. The screen glitched violently, and for a split second, it showed what looked like the entrance of the very graveyard beside my house, not the virtual hotel lobby we were supposed to see. We stared at the screen, bewildered and scared, as it returned to normal. "Dude, did you see that?" Abdul whispered, his voice barely hiding his fear. "Yeah," I replied, my voice trembling. Let's keep playing. It must be a bug." But the game had changed. Now, each challenge seemed to mirror something terrifyingly personal. One task had us singing a lullaby to calm a spectral child, and as we hesitated, the sound of a real child's laughter echoed through my house. Chills ran up my spine as we searched the room with wide eyes, only to find nothing. The final straw came when the game dared us to enter a room in the hotel, marked with the same number as my house address, 666. As we hesitated, the air grew oppressively cold, and the faint smell of soil and decay seeped through the room. Before we could make a move, the lights flickered out, plunging us into darkness. A low, mournful moan filled the air, rising from the direction of the graveyard. "Turn it off!" Abdul shouted, panic-stricken, fumbling in the dark. I scrambled towards the laptop, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but before I could shut it down, a piercing scream erupted from the speakers, followed by an ominous silence. Then, in the blackness, we heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from the kitchen. Something unseen brushed past me, its touch like ice. "Run!" I yelled, and we bolted towards the staircase, not daring to look back as the footsteps grew louder, chasing us with a relentless, ghostly stride. As we reached the top of the stairs, the air turned frigid, and the door to my room swung open on its own, revealing nothing but engulfing darkness inside. We backed away, breaths visible in the freezing air, as a deep, guttural growl emerged, followed by a movement in the darkness. The figure that emerged from the shadows bore a striking resemblance to a character from the game, but it moved with a fluidity that no digital animation could replicate. Its eyes locked onto us, its gaze piercing through the dim light. Abdul backed away, stumbling over the stairs. "Brian, what is that?" he gasped. I could barely find my voice. I don't know, but we can't stay here." We ran down and headed for the door, but it was locked by an unseen force. We just couldn't open it. By the time the figure came down as well, we edged around the room, keeping our eyes fixed on the ghostly apparition. Suddenly, the game blared a loud screech from the computer speakers, making us flinch. The figure seemed to respond, its form flickering like static as it moved closer. "Look at the screen!" Abdul pointed towards the monitor where the words, "Do not turn your back," flashed ominously. With hearts racing, we followed the instruction, moving backwards toward the door. Every step we took, the figure mirrored, its movements eerily synchronized with ours. The air grew thick with a foul stench, and I could barely suppress the urge to gag. "We need to leave now," I insisted, grabbing Abdul's arm. We managed to back out of that room and slam the door shut, pressing our weight against it. Heavy thuds came from the other side, as if something or someone was pounding on it with great force.
What do we do now? I don't know, but we can't let it out.
We moved away, heading to the kitchen to find something to barricade the door. As we scrambled, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness intermittently. Suddenly, my phone rang, slicing through the silence with its shrill tone. I answered it hesitantly, only to hear a distorted voice whisper that it's not over yet. The line went dead before I could respond. I looked at Abdul, my fear escalating.
It's like the game. It's playing with us.
We returned to the door, armed with kitchen knives. We could hear whispers now, murmuring from within the room, words that made little sense but chilled us to the bone. We stood guard, waiting for any sign of movement. Hours passed, the night stretching on endlessly. But as the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, the noise and the eerie presence began to dissipate. The heavy atmosphere lifted, and it felt like we could breathe again. We cautiously opened the door, half expecting the figure to be waiting, but the room was empty, the game still running on the screen as if nothing had happened. Abdul and I looked at each other, the relief palpable, but the fear of the night's events lingering. We spent the morning putting things back in order, but decided to not tell our parents what had happened. Thankfully, my father got a contract soon in a different city, and we moved out of that house.